When privileged high school students decided to humiliate the quiet cafeteria worker they saw as beneath them, they had no idea they were targeting a decorated Marine Corps combat instructor who had trained some of the military's deadliest fighters. What happened next will leave you absolutely speechless and restore your faith in justice being served. This is a story of respect, consequences, and why you should never judge someone by their uniform. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria Santos moved through the bustling cafeteria of Riverside High School like a ghost in a hairnet, her weathered hands ladling portions of mashed potatoes and green beans with mechanical precision. At 48, she had the kind of invisible presence that came from years of being overlooked, dismissed as just another middle-aged woman in a stained apron serving lunch to teenagers who barely acknowledged her existence. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform consisting of the same faded navy polo shirt and khaki pants that marked her as part of the service staff, forever separate from the academic world that hummed around her. To the students of Riverside High, Maria was furniture. They passed through her line daily, grabbing their trays with barely a glance, treating her like a vending machine that happened to have a human face attached. Some days, she might as well have been invisible, standing behind the sneeze guard, watching hundreds of young faces flow past her station without ever really seeing her as a person. She had been working in the cafeteria for 3 years now, ever since she had quietly settled in Oakville, Ohio, a small industrial town where everyone minded their own business and questions about your past were considered impolite. The cafeteria itself was a typical high school setup, with long rectangular tables arranged in neat rows under harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sickly. The walls were painted that institutional beige that seemed to be standard in schools everywhere, broken up by motivational posters about kindness and respect that most students ignored. The serving line where Maria worked was separated from the dining area by a low barrier, creating a clear division between the servers and the served, the workers and the students, the invisible and the important. Riverside High School sat at the heart of Oakville like a brick-and-mortar monument to small-town pride. The building itself was old but well-maintained, with wide hallways lined with trophy cases showcasing decades of athletic achievements and academic accomplishments. The school served as the centerpiece of a community where Friday night football games were social events and graduation ceremonies brought the whole town together. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did, and where your social status was established early and rarely challenged. The student body at Riverside fell into the predictable hierarchies that seem to exist in every American high school. At the top of the food chain were the athletes and the wealthy kids, those whose parents owned the local businesses or held positions of influence in the community. These students moved through the halls with the confidence that came from knowing the world was essentially designed for their success. They wore designer clothes, even when the dress code technically prohibited them, drove expensive cars to school, and treated the building like their personal kingdom. Among this elite group, none stood taller than Chad Morrison, the 17-year-old, senior class president whose family had owned Morrison Construction for 3 generations. Chad was the golden boy of Riverside High, with the kind of naturally athletic build and easy smile that made teachers and administrators remember why they had gotten into education in the first place. He played varsity lacrosse, maintained a solid B+ average without appearing to try very hard, and had already been accepted to Ohio State University on a partial athletic scholarship. More importantly, he possessed that indefinable quality that made other students want to be around. him to bask in his approval and fear his displeasure. Chad's inner circle reflected his own elevated status in the school's ecosystem. His girlfriend, Destiny Kim, was a 16-year-old junior whose family had moved to Oakville when her father took over as plant manager at the local automotive parts factory. Destiny had adapted to her new environment by immediately identifying the power structure and positioning herself within it, using her striking looks and sharp intelligence to secure her place at Chad's side. She had long black hair that she spent considerable time styling each morning and a wardrobe that pushed the boundaries of the school dress code without quite crossing the line into violation. Mason Torres served as the group's entertainer, a 17-year-old whose quick wit and willingness to push boundaries had earned him a reputation as the class clown. Mason came from a working-class family, his father employed at the same factory as Destiny's, but his humor and loyalty to Chad had earned him a place in the inner circle that his economic status alone never could have achieved. He spent most of his free time creating content for his social media accounts, always looking for the next viral moment that might launch him beyond the confines of small-town life. Jake Russell completed the core group, Chad's best friend since elementary school and co-captain of the football team. Jake was the muscle of the operation, not particularly bright, but fiercely loyal and blessed with the kind of imposing physical presence that made other students think twice before challenging the group's authority. His family ran Russell's Auto Repair, one of the most successful businesses in town, which gave him additional social capital beyond his athletic achievements. The fifth member of their circle was Brittany Walsh, a 16-year-old junior who had cultivated an image as Riverside High's resident social media expert. Brittany documented everything from outfit choices to lunch selections, treating her high school experience like a reality show for her several thousand followers across the various platforms. She came from old Oakville money, her grandfather having founded the bank that still bore the Walsh family name, and she carried herself with the entitled confidence that came from never having to worry about money or consequences. This group ruled Riverside High not through fear or intimidation, but through the more subtle power of social exclusion and public humiliation. They were the arbiters of what was cool and what was cringe, who was worth knowing and who deserved to be ignored. Their approval could elevate a freshman to unexpected popularity, while their disdain could make even a senior's life miserable. They wielded their influence like a weapon, always careful to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring that everyone understood the natural order of things. For 3 years, Maria had watched this dynamic play out from her position behind the serving line, observing the daily theater of teenage hierarchy with the detached interest of someone who had seen much worse things in much worse places. She noticed which students ate alone, which ones put on fake smiles when the popular kids deigned to acknowledge them, and which ones had given up trying to fit in entirely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She saw the subtle cruelties and casual dismissals that shaped young lives in ways the perpetrators never considered or cared about. What none of them knew, what nobody in Oakville had any reason to suspect, was that Maria Santos had spent 12 years in the United States Marine Corps before arriving in their quiet town. She had enlisted at 18, fresh out of high school, in a rough neighborhood of Detroit, where military service represented one of the few paths to a better life. The Marines had taken an angry young woman with a chip on her shoulder and forged her into something harder than steel and twice as dangerous. Maria's military career had been extraordinary by any measure. She had served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, where her unit had been responsible for training Afghan National Army forces in close-quarters combat techniques. Her natural aptitude for hand-to-hand combat had been noticed early in her service. and she had been selected for additional training at the Marine Corps Martial Arts Center of Excellence. By the time she reached the rank of Staff Sergeant, she was one of the Corps' premier instructors in the Marine Corps Martial Arts program, responsible for training Marines in everything from basic self-defense to advanced combat techniques. The skills Maria had developed over her military career went far beyond simple fighting ability. She had learned to read body language and assess threats with the kind of precision that kept soldiers alive in hostile environments. She could spot weakness, recognize deception, and identify the exact moment when someone's confidence would crack under pressure. These were not party tricks or theoretical knowledge, but practical skills honed through years of training warriors who would depend on those lessons to survive in combat. More importantly, Maria had learned the discipline and strategic thinking that separated professional soldiers from mere fighters. She understood patience, the value of careful observation, and the importance of choosing your battles wisely. The Marine Corps had taught her that true strength was not about proving yourself to others, but about accomplishing your mission with maximum efficiency and minimum unnecessary drama. These lessons had served her well through multiple deployments and countless training exercises, but they would prove even more valuable in the unexpected battleground of a high school cafeteria. Maria's transition to civilian life had not been easy. Like many veterans, she had struggled to find her place in a world that seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign after years of military service. The job market for middle-aged female veterans was challenging, and she had discovered that many employers were uncomfortable with her background, unsure how to relate to a woman who had spent over a decade in what they considered a man's profession. The cafeteria job at Riverside High had been a practical choice rather than a calling, offering steady work with benefits and the kind of routine that helped her adjust to civilian rhythms. She had chosen Oakville specifically because it was the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about your past. The town was small enough that everyone felt safe, but large enough that you could maintain your privacy if you wanted to. Maria rented a modest apartment above the downtown bakery, walked to work each morning, and spent her evenings reading or working in the small garden the bakery owner allowed her to maintain behind the building. It was a quiet life, almost boring by some standards, but it provided the peace and stability she had craved after years of structured chaos. The cafeteria staff at Riverside High consisted of 6 full-time employees led by Dorothy Fleming, a 61-year-old supervisor who had been feeding students for nearly 30 years. Mrs. Fleming, as she insisted on being called by everyone, including her peers, ran the operation with the efficiency of someone who had seen every possible cafeteria crisis and developed systems to handle them all. She was one of the few people at the school who had taken the time to get to know Maria as a person, rather than just another pair of hands to serve food. Angela Rodriguez served as Maria's closest colleague and the nearest thing she had to a friend in Oakville. Angela was a 42-year-old single mother who had been working in the cafeteria for 8 years, ever since her divorce had left her needing steady employment with health insurance. She was warm and talkative where Maria was quiet and reserved, but somehow their personalities complemented each other perfectly. Angela had a gift for reading people and situations, and she had sensed from the beginning that Maria was carrying stories she wasn't ready to share. The daily routine in the cafeteria followed a predictable pattern that Maria found comforting after years of military precision. She arrived each morning at 6:30 to help with food preparation, spending the early hours chopping vegetables, mixing salads, and preparing the day's hot entrees under Mrs. Fleming's careful supervision. The work was repetitive but satisfying in its own way, requiring just enough attention to keep her mind occupied without being mentally taxing. The serving period began at 11:15 with the first lunch shift. mostly consisting of freshmen and sophomores who moved through the line with the nervous energy of young teenagers trying to navigate social situations while managing their hunger. Maria had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which students were struggling financially, quietly ensuring that their portions were a little more generous than the standard serving size. Mrs. Fleming had noticed this practice early on but chose to look the other way, recognizing that Maria's background had given her insight into what real hunger looked like. The second lunch shift, starting at 12:10, brought the juniors and seniors through the line, including Chad Morrison and his circle of friends. This group had established their own routine over the years, always arriving precisely 10 minutes after the lunch period began to ensure that any lines had diminished and they could move through quickly without having to wait behind underclassmen. They treated the cafeteria staff with the kind of casual dismissal that teenagers often showed adults in service positions, neither rude enough to attract attention nor polite enough to suggest genuine respect. Chad's approach to the serving line exemplified his overall attitude toward those he considered beneath his social status. He would arrive at Maria's station with his tray extended, eyes already focused on his friend's table or his phone screen, treating the interaction as a necessary but unremarkable transaction. He never said please or thank you, never made eye contact, and certainly never acknowledged Maria as anything more than a functionary whose job was to provide him with food. It was not malicious behavior, simply the thoughtless entitlement of someone who had never been required to consider the humanity of people who served him. Destiny followed a similar pattern, though her dismissal carried a sharper edge that suggested more conscious disregard than Chad's thoughtless privilege. She would stand at the serving line, reviewing her phone messages or checking her appearance in her front-facing camera, extending her tray without looking up and occasionally making comments to her friends about the food that were clearly intended for Maria to overhear. Her favorite complaints involved the cafeteria's failure to offer more sophisticated cuisine, as if a public school food service budget should cater to her more refined palate. Mason treated the serving line like another opportunity for entertainment, often making jokes about the food or the staff that were just clever enough to avoid being reported, but pointed enough to ensure that everyone understood his superior position in the school's hierarchy. He had developed a particular talent for comments that could be interpreted as either harmless teasing or subtle insults, depending on the listener's perspective and willingness to confront him about his behavior. Jake's interactions with the cafeteria staff were perhaps the most telling, as his lack of intelligence made his attitudes more transparent than those of his more cunning friends. He treated Maria and her colleagues like NPCs in a video game, functional but not quite real, existing solely to provide him with whatever he needed without requiring any consideration of their feelings or circumstances. His orders were delivered as statements rather than requests, and he genuinely seemed surprised on the rare occasions when staff members didn't immediately comply with his expectations. Brittany documented everything for her social media presence, including regular critiques of the school lunch program that painted the cafeteria staff as obstacles to her content creation rather than human beings trying to do their jobs. She had developed a series of running jokes about cafeteria fashion and lunch lady stereotypes that played well with her followers but created a constant undercurrent of mockery that made every interaction uncomfortable for the staff. For 3 years, Maria had tolerated these daily indignities with the patience she had learned during her military service. She understood that teenagers were often thoughtless rather than genuinely cruel, and she had dealt with far worse disrespect from people whose opinions actually mattered to her mission. The key to survival in any hostile environment was maintaining focus on your objectives while avoiding unnecessary confrontations that could compromise your position or effectiveness. But patience, even military-trained patience, had its limits. and Maria Santos was about to discover that some lines, once crossed, demanded a response that would remind everyone involved about the difference between service and servitude, between kindness and weakness, and between a person who chose to remain quiet and someone who simply hadn't found the right moment to speak. The morning of October 15th dawned grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed to seep into everyone's mood and make ordinary tensions feel sharper. Maria arrived at her usual time to find the cafeteria buzzing with an unusual energy that she couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Fleming was moving with more urgency than normal, and even Angela seemed distracted as they went through their morning preparations. The reason became clear when the first announcements crackled over the intercom during second period. Homecoming week had officially begun at Riverside High, and with it came all the traditions and pressures that made this particular time of year both exciting and treacherous for students navigating the school's social landscape. The hallways were decorated with streamers in the school colors of blue and gold, and every conversation seemed to revolve around the upcoming dance, the football game against their biggest rivals, and the various competitions that would determine who reigned supreme during this most important week of the school year. For Chad Morrison and his friends, Homecoming Week represented an opportunity to cement their legacy as the most influential students in Riverside High history. Chad was not only senior class president, but also a member of the homecoming court, virtually guaranteed to be crowned king, alongside whatever girl the student body deemed worthy of being his queen. The week ahead would be filled with events designed to showcase school spirit, but more importantly, it would provide multiple platforms for the popular students to demonstrate their dominance over their less fortunate classmates. The energy in the cafeteria during the first lunch shift was notably different from the usual routine. Freshmen and sophomores chatted excitedly about the week's events while trying to figure out how they might insert themselves into activities traditionally dominated by upperclassmen. The decorating committee had even extended their efforts into the lunchroom, hanging banners and balloons that transformed the normally utilitarian space into something approaching festive. Maria noticed the change immediately, but continued her work with the same steady focus she brought to every shift. She had observed enough homecoming weeks during her 3 years at Riverside to understand that the increased excitement often led to increased tensions as students felt more pressure to prove themselves worthy of inclusion in the social elite. The cafeteria staff had learned to expect more complaints about food, more demands for special treatment, and generally more difficult behavior from students who were already operating on heightened emotions. When the second lunch shift began, the difference in atmosphere was even more pronounced. The upperclassmen entered the cafeteria with the swagger of conquering heroes, their conversations louder and more animated than usual. Chad's group occupied their usual table near the windows, but today they seemed determined to ensure that everyone in the room was aware of their presence and their plans for the week ahead. Brittany had positioned herself strategically to capture content for her social media accounts, documenting everything from her outfit choices to the expressions on other students' faces as they watched the popular table. She had been building anticipation for homecoming week among her followers for months, promising behind-the-scenes access to the most exclusive events and the most influential students. Her phone was constantly in motion, recording short videos and taking photos that would later be edited and posted with captions designed to emphasize her insider status. Mason was in particularly fine form, entertaining the table with increasingly elaborate stories about his plans for homecoming pranks that would supposedly become legendary among future classes. His humor had always walked the line between clever and cruel, but the excitement of homecoming week seemed to be pushing him toward more aggressive targets and more public displays of his wit. He kept glancing around the cafeteria as if searching for inspiration or victims for his next viral moment, Jake was discussing the upcoming football game with the intensity of someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in athletic achievement. As co-captain, he felt enormous pressure to lead his team to victory against their rivals, and that stress was manifesting in a shorter temper and less patience for anyone who couldn't contribute to his success. He had been snapping at teammates during practice and treating underclassmen with even less consideration than usual. Destiny was perhaps the most visibly affected by the heightened tensions of homecoming week. Despite her position as Chad's girlfriend and her secure place within the social elite, she was acutely aware that homecoming queen elections were still a week away and that her coronation was not absolutely guaranteed. She had been monitoring social media obsessively, tracking likes and comments on photos of potential competitors and analyzing every interaction for signs of shifting loyalties among their classmates. The conversation at their table grew increasingly animated as they discussed their plans for the week, each trying to top the others with stories of parties they would attend, events they would dominate, and ways they would ensure their supremacy over the student body. The discussion eventually turned to the various school traditions that marked homecoming week, including the senior prank that was scheduled for Thursday and the informal competitions that determined which students would be remembered as the true leaders of their class. It was Mason who first suggested that they needed to do something special to mark the beginning of homecoming week, something that would establish the tone for the days ahead and remind everyone of their position in the school hierarchy. His eyes swept the cafeteria as he spoke, clearly searching for an opportunity to demonstrate his creativity and willingness to push boundaries for the entertainment of his friends. Chad nodded approvingly at the suggestion, his natural leadership instincts recognizing an opportunity to reinforce his group's dominance while appearing spontaneous and fun-loving. He understood intuitively that homecoming week required a certain level of performance from its key players, and that failure to meet expectations could result in a loss of status that might be difficult to recover before graduation. The conversation continued as they finished their lunch, with various suggestions being proposed and rejected as either too tame or too risky. They needed something that would be memorable without crossing lines that might result in serious consequences from school administration. The prank had to be visible enough to ensure that word spread throughout the school, but sophisticated enough to reflect their superior creativity and intelligence. As the lunch period neared its end, their discussion had not yet produced a concrete plan, but the energy at their table had reached a fever pitch of anticipation and excitement. They were clearly committed to marking homecoming week with some kind of statement that would reinforce their position and provide content for Brittany's social media documentation. It was then that Mason's attention focused on the serving line, where Maria was efficiently cleaning up from the lunch service while preparing for the final wave of students who would arrive just before the period ended. Her methodical movements and quiet demeanor made her an obvious target for someone looking to demonstrate his wit and superiority to an appreciative audience. The idea formed in Mason's mind with the sudden clarity that often accompanied his best pranks, and he leaned forward to share it with his friends in a voice just loud enough to ensure that nearby tables could overhear and appreciate his cleverness. His plan was simple but effective, designed to provide maximum entertainment value while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. The group's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic, with each member contributing suggestions that would enhance the spectacle while ensuring that their roles were clearly established for any observers. Chad's approval gave the plan official sanction, while Destiny's excitement indicated that she saw the entertainment value as worth any potential risks. Jake's grin suggested that he was eager to play his part in what promised to be a memorable moment, and Brittany was already positioning her phone to capture the action for her followers. Maria, focused on her work and accustomed to filtering out the constant chatter of teenage voices, was not immediately aware that she had become the center of their attention. She continued wiping down serving surfaces and organizing the remaining food items with the same methodical precision she brought to every task, her movements economical and efficient in the way that marked her as someone who understood the value of completing work properly rather than simply quickly. The final minutes of the lunch period typically involved a last-minute rush of students who had spent most of their time socializing rather than eating, and Maria was prepared for the usual scramble to serve stragglers before the bell rang. What she was not prepared for was the coordinated approach of Chad's entire group, moving toward the serving line with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested they had something specific in mind beyond simply getting food. Chad approached the serving line first, his usual casual confidence amplified by the knowledge that his friends were watching and recording his performance. He carried his tray with deliberate slowness, making it clear that he was in no hurry, and that the normal expectations of cafeteria efficiency did not apply to him during this special moment. His smile was the practiced expression of someone who had learned early that charm could excuse almost any behavior, at least temporarily. Maria looked up as he approached, noting the unusual energy in his demeanor, but not yet understanding its significance. She had served him hundreds of times over the past 3 years, and while their interactions had never been particularly warm, they had followed a predictable pattern that she had come to expect. Today felt different, but she could not yet identify the source of her unease. Behind Chad, his friends arranged themselves in a loose semicircle that would provide optimal viewing angles for whatever was about to unfold. Brittany held her phone at chest level, angled to capture both Chad's performance and Maria's reaction, without being obvious about her recording. Mason wore the anticipatory grin of someone about to witness his own creative genius in action, while Jake cracked his knuckles in a gesture that was probably unconscious, but served to emphasize his physical presence. Destiny positioned herself where she could observe the reactions of other students in the cafeteria, understanding that part of the entertainment value would come from watching their classmates respond to whatever Chad was planning. She had developed a keen sense for reading social situations, and she could already see that several nearby tables had noticed the unusual formation and were preparing to pay attention to whatever happened next. The serving line during the final minutes of lunch period typically moved with hurried efficiency, as students grabbed quick portions and rushed to finish eating before the bell rang. Today, however, Chad's deliberate pace was creating a bottleneck that forced other students to wait, adding to the sense that something unusual was about to occur. The growing audience only added to Maria's sense that this interaction was going to deviate from the normal routine. Chad reached Maria's station and paused, making a show of examining the available food options as if he had never seen them before. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried clearly across the cafeteria in a way that seemed calculated to ensure maximum audibility for anyone who might be interested in listening. "You know what, Maria?" he said, using her name with the kind of false familiarity that immediately put her on guard. "I've been thinking about how hard you work here, serving all of us ungrateful teenagers day after day. It really is admirable, the way you've dedicated your life to making sure we get our nutrition." The words themselves might have been interpreted as complimentary, but the tone carried an unmistakable undercurrent of mockery that made it clear to everyone listening that this was not a genuine expression of appreciation. Maria felt her shoulders tense slightly, her military training automatically assessing the situation for potential threats, while her civilian experience reminded her that this was just a teenager trying to impress his friends. Mason stepped forward then, his role in the performance clearly choreographed in advance. His voice carried the same false sincerity as Chad's, but with an additional layer of theatrical emotion that made the mockery even more obvious to anyone in paying attention. "She really is an inspiration," Mason added, his hand dramatically placed over his heart in a gesture that would have been comical if it weren't so deliberately cruel. "I mean, look at her dedication, day after day, serving the same food, wearing the same uniform, living the same routine. It takes a special kind of person to find fulfillment in such simple work." The other students in the cafeteria were beginning to take notice now, drawn by the unusual tone and volume of the conversation at the serving line. Some looked uncomfortable, sensing that something unpleasant was developing, but uncertain whether they should intervene or simply look away. Others leaned forward with the kind of eager anticipation that often accompanied teenage drama, excited to witness whatever spectacle was about to unfold. Maria maintained her composure, her expression neutral as she continued to hold Chad's tray, waiting for him to make his actual food selections. Her military training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to avoid reactive behavior that might escalate a situation unnecessarily. But beneath the surface, she was rapidly assessing the dynamics at play and calculating potential responses to whatever was coming next. Brittany moved closer, her phone now openly recording as she documented what she clearly expected to be a memorable moment for her social media presence. Her followers had come to expect a certain level of exclusive content from her accounts, and she understood that homecoming week provided opportunities for the kind of viral moments that could significantly boost her online influence. It was Jake who escalated the situation to the next level, his role apparently being to add physical comedy to complement the verbal mockery that Chad and Mason had established. He approached the serving line with exaggerated clumsiness, bumping into the sneeze guard and causing it to rattle loudly enough to draw even more attention from across the cafeteria. "Whoops," he said with obviously fake embarrassment, his voice loud enough to ensure that his clumsiness was noticed by as many people as possible. "Sorry about that, Maria. Sometimes I forget how delicate everything is around here. I guess I don't always know my own strength." The implication was clear to everyone watching. Jake's comment about not knowing his own strength was a reference to Maria's perceived weakness, a suggestion that the equipment she worked with daily was more fragile than the powerful teenager who graced her presence. It was the kind of casual cruelty that teenagers often employed when they wanted to establish dominance without crossing lines that might result in serious consequences. Destiny then delivered what was clearly intended to be the culminating insult, her voice carrying the sharp edge that had made her reputation as someone who could cut people down with words when necessary. She had been observing Maria's reactions carefully, looking for signs of distress or anger that would indicate their performance was having the desired effect. "You know what we should do?" Destiny announced, her voice pitched to carry across the cafeteria while maintaining the pretense of addressing only her immediate friends. "We should nominate Maria for homecoming queen. I mean, she's been serving this school faithfully for years, and isn't that exactly the kind of school spirit we should be celebrating?" The suggestion was met with loud laughter from her friends, the kind of exaggerated response that made it clear they considered the idea absurd rather than genuine. The laughter was designed to emphasize the ridiculousness of suggesting that someone like Maria could ever be considered worthy of the kind of honor typically reserved for popular, attractive teenage girls. But it was Mason who delivered the final blow, the comment that transformed what had been merely thoughtless cruelty into something more deliberately vicious. His voice dropped to a stage whisper that somehow carried even more clearly than the previous loud declarations, creating an intimate moment of shared mockery that included the growing audience while excluding Maria herself. "Can you imagine?" he said, his eyes sweeping the gathered students to ensure they were all paying attention to his wit. Maria Santos, Homecoming Queen 2024. She could wear her hairnet as a crown and carry a serving spoon as a scepter. Maybe her homecoming dress could be made out of those plastic gloves she wears. The image he painted was met with renewed laughter from his friends and scattered chuckles from some of the observing students. The mental picture of Maria in formal, wear made from cafeteria supplies, was absurd enough to be genuinely funny to some observers, while others laughed simply because they felt pressure to respond appropriately to what the popular students found amusing. But Mason was not finished. His success in getting laughs from the previous comment emboldened him to push further, to see how much entertainment value he could extract from this moment before the lunch period ended and the opportunity passed. Actually, he continued, his voice gaining volume and confidence as he built toward what he clearly considered his masterstroke, why wait for homecoming? Let's crown her right now. After all, she's already got the perfect outfit for it. Before Maria could react, Mason reached across the serving line and grabbed her hairnet, the elastic band snapping as he pulled it from her head with enough force to cause several strands of her graying hair to come loose. Her hair, normally restrained in a tight bun, began to fall around her shoulders in a way that immediately made her feel exposed and vulnerable. The cafeteria erupted in laughter and gasps, the sudden physical nature of Mason's action crossing a line that transformed the situation from verbal mockery into something approaching assault. Students throughout the room turned to stare, some laughing at the spectacle, while others looked uncomfortable with the escalation but uncertain about how to respond. Mason held the hairnet aloft like a trophy, his grin wide as he soaked in the attention and approval of his audience. "Behold," he announced in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet cafeteria, "the crown jewels of our beloved lunch lady." Chad stepped forward then, clearly intending to capitalize on Mason's success by adding his own physical comedy to the performance. He reached for Maria's serving spoon, apparently planning to continue the mock coronation ceremony that Mason had initiated. His movement was casual and confident, reflecting his assumption that Maria would offer no resistance to their entertainment. But as Chad's hand closed around the serving spoon, something fundamental shifted in Maria's demeanor. The careful neutrality that had characterized her expression throughout the encounter disappeared, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Her posture straightened in a way that subtly but significantly altered the dynamics of the space around the serving line. For the first time in 3 years of serving these students, Maria Santos looked directly into Chad Morrison's eyes with the full intensity of someone who had spent 12 years in the United States Marine Corps. And in that moment, Chad caught a glimpse of something that made his confident smile falter and his hand hesitate on the serving spoon. The change in Maria's demeanor was so subtle that most of the students watching the spectacle didn't immediately notice it, but Chad felt it like a physical force. The woman who had served his lunch quietly for 3 years was suddenly occupying space in a completely different way, her presence commanding attention rather than deflecting it. The serving spoon remained in her grip, and when Chad tried to take it, he discovered that her hold was considerably stronger than he had anticipated. "I think you should let go now," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying none of the deference that Chad had come to expect from cafeteria staff. The words were spoken calmly, without any obvious threat, but there was something in her tone that made several nearby students take an unconscious step backward. Chad, confused by the unexpected resistance, tightened his grip on the spoon and attempted to pull it away with more force. His 17-year-old muscles, honed by years of lacrosse training, should have been more than adequate to overpower a middle-aged cafeteria worker. Instead, he found himself locked in a contest of strength that he was clearly not winning. Mason, still riding the high of his successful hairnet grab, failed to read the changing atmosphere and decided to escalate further. He reached across the serving line toward the industrial-sized container of mashed potatoes, apparently intending to complete the mock coronation by dumping food on Maria's head. His movement was theatrical and exaggerated, designed to maximize the visual impact. For Brittany's recording, what happened next occurred so quickly that most observers had trouble processing the sequence of events. Maria released the serving spoon, causing Chad to stumble backward as his pulling motion suddenly met no resistance. In the same fluid movement, she intercepted Mason's reaching arm with precision that spoke of years of training in close quarters. Combat. Her grip on his wrist was not violent, but it was absolutely controlled. Mason found himself frozen in position, his arm extended toward the mashed potatoes, but completely unable to complete his intended motion. The expression of confident amusement on his face began to shift toward confusion, and then genuine concern as he realized that he could not break free from her hold. "Mason Torres," Maria said, her voice still quiet but now carrying a note of authority that cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade. 17 years old, lives on Maple Street with his parents and younger sister. Father works at the automotive plant. Mother teaches 3rd grade at Roosevelt Elementary. You make videos for social media and dream of becoming famous for your pranks. The specificity of her knowledge was unsettling enough, but it was the way she delivered the information that made Mason's face go pale. Her voice carried the clinical detachment of someone reciting intelligence briefings, each detail delivered with the kind of precision that suggested access to much more comprehensive information than what she had chosen to share. Chad, still, recovering his balance from the sudden release of the serving spoon, stared at Maria with growing alarm. The woman who had served his lunch without incident for 3 years was suddenly demonstrating capabilities that didn't fit with anything he thought he knew about cafeteria workers. More importantly, she was displaying a level of situational awareness that suggested she knew far more about the students than anyone had realized. "Jake Russell," Maria continued, her eyes shifting to the co-captain of the football team. "Your family's auto repair shop has been struggling financially since the chain stores moved into town. Your father hasn't told you that he's considering selling the business to pay for your college tuition, but he discusses it with your mother every night after you go to bed." The color drained from Jake's face as Maria's words hit him with the force of personal revelation. The financial struggles of Russell's auto repair were supposed to be a family secret, something his parents had worked hard to hide from their son to avoid adding stress during his senior year. The fact that the lunch lady not only knew about their problems, but understood their intimate details was deeply unsettling. Brittany, still recording on her phone, began to lower the device as she realized that the situation was rapidly moving beyond anything she had expected to capture. The confident mockery that had characterized the beginning of their encounter was being replaced by something much more serious and potentially dangerous. Her followers expected entertainment, not the kind of uncomfortable revelations that Maria seemed capable of delivering. "Brittany Walsh," Maria said, turning her attention to the social media influencer with the same clinical precision she had used on the others. "Your grandfather's bank is currently under investigation by federal regulators for irregularities in small business lending practices. Your family knows about the investigation, but believes they've kept it secret from the community. They haven't." The implications of Maria's knowledge were staggering. These weren't random guesses or information that could be gathered through casual observation. She was demonstrating access to details about their families, their private conversations, and their closely guarded secrets that suggested either sophisticated surveillance capabilities or connections to sources of information that a cafeteria worker should not possess. Destiny Kim, Maria continued, her grip on Mason's wrist never wavering as she systematically addressed each member of the group. Your father didn't get promoted to plant manager because of his qualifications. He got the position because the previous manager was embezzling money, and your father helped cover up the theft in exchange for his advancement. The company knows, but they're keeping him in place because firing him would require them to acknowledge how long the embezzlement went undetected. Destiny's carefully constructed composure cracked visibly as Maria's words hit their target. The Kim family's rapid rise in Oakville's social hierarchy had been built on the foundation of her father's promotion, and the suggestion that his success was tainted by corruption was devastating to their carefully maintained image of merit-based achievement. The cafeteria around them had fallen nearly silent, with students throughout the room sensing that something extraordinary was happening at the serving line, but unable to fully comprehend what they were witnessing. The usual background noise of teenage conversation and the clatter of trays had been replaced by an atmosphere of tense attention, focused entirely on Maria and her captive audience. "And Chad Morrison," Maria said finally, her attention returning to the self-proclaimed leader of the group. Senior class president, lacrosse star, college-bound young man with the world at his feet. "But you're not going to Ohio State, are you? Your father's construction company has been cutting corners on safety inspections for municipal projects, and when the state investigation concludes next month, he's going to lose his contractor's license. Your family will be bankrupt by Christmas, and your scholarship offer will be meaningless because you won't be able to afford the expenses it doesn't cover." Chad's world tilted on its axis as Maria's words sank in. The Morrison family's financial troubles were supposed to be a temporary setback, a minor difficulty that his father was handling through connections and influence in the local government. The suggestion that their problems were serious enough to threaten the family business was terrifying, but the implication that Maria somehow knew the timeline and details of a state investigation was beyond comprehension. The 5 teenagers stood frozen around the serving line, each processing the realization that their most carefully guarded family secrets had just been exposed by someone they had dismissed as beneath their notice. The power dynamic that had seemed so clear when they approached Maria's station had been completely reversed, leaving them vulnerable and exposed while she remained in complete control of the situation. Angela Rodriguez, who had been working at the adjacent serving station, watched the unfolding confrontation with growing amazement. She had worked alongside Maria for 3 years without ever seeing her display anything approaching this level of authority or knowledge. The quiet, reserved woman she thought she knew was revealing capabilities that suggested a background far more complex than anything Angela had imagined. Mrs. Fleming, supervising from her position near the kitchen entrance, also observed the scene with increasing interest. Her 30 years of experience managing cafeteria operations had given her insight into student behavior and staff capabilities, but Maria's demonstration was unlike anything she had encountered in her career. The precision and confidence with which Maria was handling the confrontation suggested training and experience that went far beyond food service. Mason, still trapped in Maria's grip, finally found his voice. "How do you know all that?" he whispered. His earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of her demonstrations. "Who are you?" Maria's expression softened slightly, but her hold on his wrist remained firm. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness, as if she regretted the necessity of revealing capabilities she had hoped to keep hidden. "I'm someone who spent 12 years learning to pay attention," she said simply. "Someone who was trained to observe, analyze, and understand human behavior in environments where that knowledge meant the difference between life and death. Someone who chose to use those skills to serve lunch to teenagers because I thought this community deserved better than what I used to do for a living." The revelation hung in the air like smoke, slowly filling the space around them as students throughout the cafeteria began to understand that their assumptions about Maria Santos had been fundamentally wrong. She wasn't just a cafeteria worker who happened to know their secrets. She was someone with a professional background in gathering and analyzing intelligence. Someone whose presence in their school represented a dramatic career change rather than a lifetime of service work. "I'm also someone," Maria continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "who has spent 3 years watching you treat people like they don't matter, like their feelings and dignity are less important than your entertainment. Someone who has seen you use your privileges to hurt others without consequence, and who has been waiting for you to cross a line that required a response." The silence that followed Maria's revelation stretched across the cafeteria like a physical presence, broken only by the distant sounds of normal school activity continuing in other parts of the building. The usual end-of-lunch period chaos had been replaced by an atmosphere of stunned attention as students throughout the room processed what they had just witnessed and tried to understand its implications. Chad Morrison, who had never in his 17 years encountered an adult who challenged his authority so directly and effectively, found himself grappling with a complete reversal of everything he thought he understood about power dynamics and social hierarchy. The woman he had dismissed as invisible was demonstrating capabilities that suggested she could have destroyed his family's reputation at any time during the past 3 years, but had chosen instead to serve his lunch quietly while observing his behavior. The realization was deeply unsettling on multiple levels. If Maria possessed the kind of background and skills she had just demonstrated, then her decision to work in the cafeteria represented a choice rather than a limitation. She wasn't trapped in service work because she lacked other options. She was there because she had selected this environment for reasons that Chad was only beginning to understand. More troubling was the implication that his family's financial problems were not the private struggle he had believed them to be. If Maria knew about the state investigation and could predict its timeline and consequences, then other people in the community probably possessed similar knowledge. The Morrison family's carefully maintained facade of success was apparently more transparent than they had realized. Mason, still held firmly in Maria's grip, was experiencing his own crisis of understanding. His entire social identity was built around being clever and observant, able to spot weaknesses in others and exploit them for entertainment value. The discovery that he had been completely wrong about someone he encountered daily was forcing him to question his assumptions about his own perceptiveness and intelligence. The specific details Maria had shared about his family were accurate enough to be verifiable, which meant that her knowledge of the other families was probably equally reliable. The implications were staggering. If she knew about his father's job situation and his mother's teaching career, what else did she know about their private lives and personal struggles? Jake Russell was perhaps the most visibly shaken by Maria's revelations, his normally confident demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety about his family's financial situation. The possibility that his father might sacrifice the family business to pay for college expenses was something he had never considered, and the suggestion that his parents discuss these concerns without including him made him feel suddenly isolated and vulnerable. The idea that adults in his life were making major decisions based on information he didn't possess was deeply disturbing to someone who was accustomed to being treated as mature and responsible. If his parents were hiding the extent of their financial problems, what other important information might they be withholding? How many of his assumptions about his future were based on circumstances that had already changed without his knowledge? Brittany Walsh faced a different kind of crisis as she processed Maria's comments about her grandfather's banking business. The Walsh family's social status in Oakville was built on generations of financial success and community leadership, and the suggestion that their current position might be compromised by federal investigations threatened everything she understood about her place in the world. More immediately concerning was the realization that her social media presence, which she had built on her image as an insider with access to exclusive information, might be based on fundamental misconceptions about her family's true status in the community. If federal regulators were investigating the bank, then her grandfather's influence might be more precarious than she had realized. Destiny Kim was grappling with the most complex emotional response to Maria's revelations, the suggestion that her father's promotion was connected to corruption rather than merit, challenged her entire understanding of her family's success and integration into Oakville society. She had worked hard to establish herself as worthy of her position in the school's social hierarchy, and the implication that her father's advancement was tainted made her question whether her own achievements were legitimate. The broader implications were equally troubling. If Maria's information about the embezzlement cover-up was accurate, then the Kim family's position in the community was more vulnerable than they had understood. Corporate scandals had a way of destroying entire families, and the suggestion that their success was built on ethical compromises was terrifying. But beyond the individual impacts on each teenager, Maria's demonstration had revealed something more fundamental about the nature of power and perception in their small-town environment. The students of Riverside High had operated under the assumption that they understood who mattered and who didn't, who had influence and who was merely functional. Maria's revelations suggested that their understanding was not only incomplete, but dangerously wrong. The woman they had dismissed as insignificant had been observing and analyzing their behavior with professional-level skills for 3 years. She had access to information about their families that they didn't possess themselves, and she had demonstrated the ability to use that knowledge with surgical precision when circumstances required it. The power they thought they wielded was illusory, based on assumptions about social hierarchy that someone with real authority had chosen not to challenge until they forced her hand. As the immediate shock of Maria's revelations began to fade, the students throughout the cafeteria started to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their school experience. None of them had ever seen an adult respond to student mockery with such devastating effectiveness, and none of them had ever realized that the service staff they interacted with daily might possess backgrounds and capabilities far beyond their job descriptions. The implications extended beyond just Maria and the cafeteria. How many other adults in their school environment had experiences and skills that the students had never considered? How many teachers, custodians, secretaries, and other staff members had chosen their positions for reasons that had nothing to do with limited options or lack of ambition? Maria finally released her grip on Mason's wrist, but her presence continued to dominate the space around the serving line. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect in environments far more challenging than a high school cafeteria. "I want you to understand something," she said, her eyes moving deliberately from one teenager to another. "I didn't share information about your families to hurt you or to threaten you. I did it to help you understand that your assumptions about who has power and who doesn't are more complicated than you've realized." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "I've spent 3 years watching you treat people like they don't matter, like their feelings and dignity are less important than your entertainment. I've seen you dismiss classmates who don't fit your social standards, and I've watched you treat staff members like we're not quite human." The teenagers shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze, beginning to understand that this was not just a reaction to their specific behavior, but a broader commentary on patterns they had established over years of interactions. "What you discovered Today is that some of the people you've dismissed have been paying attention, Maria continued. We've been watching, and we've been remembering, and we've been making judgments about your character based on how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter. The bell that signaled the end of the lunch period chose that moment to ring, but nobody moved toward the exits. The usual rush to clear tables and gather belongings was suspended as students throughout the cafeteria remained focused on the unprecedented scene at the serving line. Mrs. Fleming stepped forward from her supervisory position, her expression mixing concern with curiosity as she approached the group. "Is everything all right over here?" she asked, her experienced eye taking in the unusual tension and the obvious distress of the students involved. Maria nodded to her supervisor with respect that was clearly genuine rather than merely professional. "Everything is fine, Mrs. Fleming. We were just having a conversation about mutual respect and proper behavior in the cafeteria." Chad found his voice for the first time since Maria had begun her revelations. "We're sorry," he said, his words coming out more quietly than he had intended. "We didn't mean to be disrespectful." Maria studied his face for a moment, apparently assessing the sincerity of his apology. "I believe you're sorry that this conversation happened," she said finally. "But I'm not convinced you're sorry about the behavior that made it necessary." Indeed, the distinction was subtle but important, and it highlighted the difference between regret about consequences and genuine remorse about actions. Chad realized that Maria was requiring him to acknowledge not just this specific incident, but the broader patterns of behavior that had led to it. "You're right," he admitted, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "We've been treating people badly, and we've been doing it because we thought we could get away with it. That was wrong, and I'm sorry for that too." Mason, Jake, Brittany, and Destiny echoed similar sentiments, each struggling to find words that adequately addressed both their immediate behavior and the larger issues that Maria had raised. The days following the cafeteria confrontation brought an unsettling quiet to Riverside High that reminded Maria of the tense calm that often preceded major military operations. Students moved through the hallways with a different energy, their conversations more subdued and their interactions with staff noticeably more cautious. Word of what had happened at the serving line had spread through the school with the speed that only high school gossip could achieve, but the details had been filtered through so many retellings that the truth had become almost mythical. Maria observed these changes with the analytical mind that had served her well during her military career. She understood that her revelation had created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled, either by students who learned from the experience, or by those who simply found more subtle ways to exercise their sense of superiority. The real test would come in the patterns that emerged over the following weeks, as the immediate shock wore off and people settled into new behavioral norms. Chad Morrison had not returned to the cafeteria since the incident, choosing instead to bring lunch from home or skip the meal entirely. His absence was noted by other students and created ripple effects throughout the social hierarchy that Maria watched with professional interest. Without their acknowledged leader present to set the tone, the various cliques and social groups were forced to navigate interactions without clear guidance about acceptable behavior. The information Maria had shared about the Morrison family's financial troubles proved to be more accurate than even she had initially realized. Within a week of their confrontation, local news outlets began reporting on the state investigation into municipal contracting practices, and Morrison Construction was specifically mentioned as a company under scrutiny. The family's attempts to maintain their usual social presence became increasingly strained as the reality of their situation became public knowledge. Maria felt no satisfaction in being proven correct about the family's troubles. Her military training had taught her to gather and analyze intelligence for strategic purposes, not for personal vindication. The Morrison family's problems were real and serious, affecting not just Chad, but his younger siblings and his parents' marriage. She had used her knowledge as a tactical necessity during the confrontation, but she took no pleasure in the human cost of their difficulties. Mason Torres had taken a different approach to processing the events in the cafeteria. Rather than avoiding the space entirely, he had begun arriving early and staying late, apparently hoping to engage Maria in further conversation. His attempts at interaction were awkward and transparent, clearly motivated by curiosity about her background. Rather than genuine interest in making amends for his behavior, Maria recognized his pattern of behavior from her experience training young Marines who believed they could charm or manipulate their way out of consequences for poor decisions. Mason's approach suggested that he viewed their confrontation as an interesting puzzle to be solved, rather than a serious lesson about respect and consequences. His inability to grasp the deeper implications of what had occurred indicated that he would likely require additional guidance before he understood the true nature of his mistakes. The social media aftermath of the incident had been particularly revealing about the different ways people processed uncomfortable truths. Brittany Walsh had initially attempted to spin the confrontation into content for her followers, posting cryptic references to drama in unexpected places and when people aren't what they seem. However, her grandfather's banking troubles had become public knowledge within days of Maria's revelation, forcing Brittany to deal with the reality that her family's influence was indeed more precarious than she had understood. The federal investigation into Walsh Community Bank had been proceeding quietly for months, but Maria's comment had prompted Brittany to ask more direct questions about her family's situation. The answers she received confirmed that the bank's lending practices were under serious scrutiny, and that her grandfather's health was declining under the stress of the investigation. The combination of family crisis and public exposure had dramatically reduced her social media activity as she grappled with problems that couldn't be solved through careful image curation. Jake Russell's response had been perhaps the most mature of the group, though it had come at considerable personal cost. His conversation with his parents about the family business had confirmed Maria's assessment of their financial situation and led to difficult discussions about his college plans and future goals. The discovery that his parents had been protecting him from the full extent of their struggles had been painful, but it had also opened lines of communication that had been closed by their desire to shield him from adult concerns. The Russell family's auto repair business was indeed struggling to compete with chain stores and online parts suppliers. But Jake's willingness to have honest conversations about their situation had led to new strategies for adapting to changing market conditions. His football skills had attracted attention from smaller colleges that could offer academic scholarships to supplement his athletic abilities, creating opportunities that didn't depend entirely on his family's financial resources. Destiny Kim's situation had proven to be the most complex and potentially dangerous of the group. The embezzlement scandal at the automotive parts factory had indeed been covered up through her father's cooperation, but Maria's revelation had prompted Destiny to research the situation more thoroughly. What she discovered was that the cover-up was more extensive than she had realized, and that her father's position remained precarious as long as the original theft remained hidden. The ethical implications of her family's situation created internal conflicts that Destiny struggled to resolve. Her father's advancement had benefited their entire family and provided opportunities that would not have been available otherwise, but the foundation of that success was built on concealing criminal activity. The knowledge that Maria possessed, detailed information about the cover-up, raised questions about who else might be aware of the situation and what consequences might eventually emerge. Throughout these individual struggles, Maria continued her daily routine in the cafeteria with the same methodical precision that had characterized her work for 3 years. The difference was that she now moved through the school environment with the awareness that her background was no longer completely secret. Some students regarded her with newfound respect, others with wariness, and a few with the kind of curiosity that suggested they were trying to piece together the details of her military service. Angela Rodriguez had proven to be the most persistent in her attempts to learn more about Maria's background, though her approach was motivated by genuine friendship rather than mere curiosity. Their conversations during food preparation had gradually become more open, with Maria sharing carefully selected details about her transition from military to civilian life. She described the challenges of adapting to environments where precision and efficiency were not always valued, and the satisfaction she found in work that fed people rather than training them for combat. Mrs. Fleming had taken a more pragmatic approach to the revelations about Maria's background, recognizing that her most reliable employee had capabilities that could benefit the entire cafeteria operation. Their discussions had focused on practical matters like improving security procedures and developing better systems for handling difficult student behavior. Maria's insights into crowd psychology and crisis management had proven valuable for addressing problems that went beyond typical food service challenges. The broader student body had reacted to the cafeteria incident with a mixture of fascination and unease that reflected their growing awareness that adults in their environment might have more complex backgrounds than they had previously considered. Conversations in hallways and classrooms increasingly included speculation about the hidden histories of teachers, custodians, and other staff members who interacted with students daily. Some students had begun treating support staff with noticeably more respect, apparently concerned that anyone they encountered might possess knowledge or capabilities that could surprise them. Others had become more guarded in their interactions, uncertain about who might be observing and analyzing their behavior for purposes they couldn't understand. The overall effect was a subtle but significant shift in the school's social atmosphere that acknowledged the possibility that power and influence might be distributed differently than traditional hierarchies suggested. Tommy Chen, a 14-year-old freshman who had been one of the frequent targets of bullying by older students, had been particularly affected by witnessing the confrontation between Maria and the popular seniors. The demonstration that seemingly powerless people might possess hidden strengths had given him hope that his own situation was not as hopeless as it had appeared. He had begun spending more time in the cafeteria during lunch periods, not because he was particularly hungry, but because he wanted to observe Maria's interactions with other students. Maria had noticed Tommy's increased presence and recognized the signs of a young person who was struggling with social dynamics beyond his control. Her experience with military personnel of all ages had taught her to identify individuals who were facing challenges that exceeded their current resources, and she saw in Tommy the same combination of intelligence and vulnerability that she had encountered in young recruits who needed guidance rather than criticism. Their conversations had begun tentatively, with Tommy asking questions about food preparation that gradually evolved into discussions about handling difficult situations and understanding human behavior. Maria found herself sharing lessons from her military training in terms that a 14-year-old could understand and apply, focusing on concepts like situational awareness, strategic thinking, and the importance of choosing battles wisely. The transformation in Tommy's confidence had been gradual but noticeable to anyone who paid attention to the subtle dynamics of student interactions. He moved through the hallways with better posture, made eye contact when speaking to classmates, and showed less obvious fear when confronted by students who had previously intimidated him. More importantly, he had begun standing up for other students who were being bullied, using techniques that de-escalated situations rather than creating additional conflicts. Principal Robert Hayes had eventually requested a meeting with Maria to discuss the incident in the cafeteria, though his approach suggested more curiosity than disciplinary concern. The meeting had taken place in his office after school hours, providing privacy for a conversation that both participants understood would be sensitive and potentially consequential. Hayes had opened the discussion by acknowledging that he had heard various versions of what had occurred during the lunch period, and that he was interested in getting an accurate account from Maria's perspective. His tone was professional but cautious, suggesting that he recognized he was dealing with someone whose background might be more complex than typical staff personnel. Maria had provided a straightforward description of the events, focusing on the student's behavior and her response, without elaborating unnecessarily on the sources of her knowledge about their families. She explained that her reaction had been prompted by behavior that crossed the line from typical teenage thoughtlessness into deliberate harassment, and that her goal had been to address the situation before it escalated further. The principal's questions had revealed that he possessed some awareness of the family's various difficulties, though perhaps not the detailed knowledge that Maria had demonstrated. His primary concerns seemed to be ensuring that the incident didn't create ongoing problems for the school, and understanding whether Maria's intervention had been effective in addressing the underlying behavioral issues. Maria had assured him that she had no intention of using personal information about students or families for purposes beyond maintaining appropriate behavior in her work environment. She explained that her background had given her skills in observation and analysis that she preferred to use constructively rather than punitively, and that her goal was to help create a more respectful environment for everyone in the school community. Hayes had concluded the meeting by expressing his appreciation for Maria's professionalism in handling a difficult situation, and by acknowledging that her approach had been more effective than traditional disciplinary measures might have been. He had also indicated that he would be available if she encountered similar problems in the future and needed administrative support for addressing inappropriate student behavior. The conversation with the principal had clarified several important points for Maria about her position within the school hierarchy and the extent to which her background would be acknowledged or utilized. It was clear that her skills were recognized and valued, but also that there was an expectation that she would continue to operate within the boundaries of her official role unless circumstances required otherwise. As October progressed toward November, the patterns that emerged from the cafeteria incident began to stabilize into new norms that reflected the lessons various people had learned from the experience. The changes were not dramatic or revolutionary, but they represented meaningful shifts in how students and staff interacted with each other and how power dynamics operated within the school environment. Maria continued to observe these developments with the analytical perspective that had served her throughout her military career, understanding that real change was typically measured in incremental improvements rather than sudden transformations. The test of whether the incident had produced lasting benefits would come in how people behaved when they thought no one was watching, and whether the lessons learned would be applied to future situations that required moral courage and ethical decision-making. The fragile equilibrium that had settled over Riverside High in the weeks following the cafeteria incident was shattered on a cold Monday morning in early November, when Chad Morrison returned to school with a new attitude and a carefully planned response to what he had come to view as his public humiliation. The financial pressures on his family had intensified as the state investigation into municipal contracting expanded, and the stress had transformed his embarrassment into something approaching anger. Chad's absence from the cafeteria had not been motivated by fear or genuine remorse, as many had assumed, but by strategic thinking that reminded Maria uncomfortably of the tactical planning she had encountered in less disciplined military units. He had spent the intervening weeks analyzing what had happened, researching Maria's background through online searches and community connections, and developing what he believed was a comprehensive plan to restore his social position while addressing the threat that her knowledge represented to his family's reputation. The first indication that Chad had moved beyond simple avoidance came during second period, when rumors began circulating through the school that someone had contacted the district's central administration with questions about the hiring practices and background verification procedures used for cafeteria staff. The inquiries had apparently focused specifically on whether all employees had undergone proper screening and whether their qualifications matched their assigned responsibilities. Maria learned about these developments through Angela, who had heard the speculation from other staff members during their morning break. The timing and specificity of the inquiries suggested a coordinated effort to create official scrutiny of Maria's employment status, using administrative procedures as a weapon rather than addressing the underlying behavioral issues that had prompted their original confrontation. The strategy was more sophisticated than Maria had expected from a 17-year-old, though she recognized the influence of adult guidance in the approach. Chad's father, despite his legal troubles, remained a prominent figure in the community with connections throughout local government and business networks. The effort to challenge Maria's position through official channels suggested that the Morrison family was applying their remaining influence to protect their son's reputation and eliminate what they perceived as a threat to their interests. Maria's military experience had included extensive training in dealing with political and bureaucratic challenges that emerged during complex operations in foreign environments. She understood that direct confrontations often created opportunities for indirect attacks through administrative and legal channels, and she had developed strategies for managing these situations without compromising operational effectiveness or personal integrity. Her first step was to contact Staff Sergeant Michael Santos, her younger brother, who remained on active duty and maintained connections throughout the military community. Their conversation, conducted through encrypted channels that reflected habits developed during classified operations, focused on ensuring that Maria's service records were properly documented and accessible through official channels. If questions arose about her background, Michael's response was both reassuring and concerning. He confirmed that Maria's military service was well documented and that her discharge had been honorable, with commendations for exceptional performance in training and leadership roles. However, he also warned that some details of her final assignments were classified at levels that might complicate attempts to verify her qualifications through standard background check procedures. The classification issues stemmed from Maria's last 2 years of service, when she had been assigned to a joint training program that worked with foreign military forces in sensitive regions. The program's existence was not secret, but many of the operational details remained classified to protect ongoing relationships and methodologies. Standard employment verification procedures might not be able to access the information needed to confirm the full extent of her qualifications and experience. Maria realized that Chad's strategy, whether intentional or accidental, had identified a genuine vulnerability in her position. While her employment had been processed through normal channels and her basic qualifications verified, a more detailed investigation might raise questions that could not be answered through standard procedures. The gap between her documented experience and her demonstrated capabilities could become a problem if scrutiny intensified beyond routine administrative review. Her second step was to schedule a private meeting with Mrs. Fleming to discuss the situation and ensure that her supervisor was prepared for any administrative inquiries that might arise. The conversation took place in the cafeteria office after hours, providing privacy for a discussion that both women understood would be sensitive and potentially consequential for Maria's continued employment. Mrs. Fleming's response demonstrated the wisdom that came from 3 decades of navigating school politics and administrative challenges. She acknowledged that she had always suspected Maria's background was more complex than her application indicated, but she had been satisfied with her performance and had chosen not to pursue questions that might complicate a successful working relationship. The supervisor's primary concern was ensuring that any investigation would find proper documentation and procedures rather than irregularities that might reflect poorly on her management of the cafeteria operation. She was prepared to testify to Maria's exceptional performance, reliability, and positive interactions with both staff and students, but she needed assurance that official inquiries would not uncover problems that she had overlooked or ignored. Maria provided detailed information about her military service and the documentation that was available through normal channels, while explaining the classification issues that might complicate verification of her most recent assignments. She also outlined the steps she was taking to ensure that all relevant information would be accessible to authorized investigators, including contact information for former supervisors who could verify her qualifications and character. The conversation concluded with Mrs. Fleming's commitment to support Maria through whatever administrative review might be triggered by the inquiries. She made it clear that she valued Maria's contributions to the cafeteria operation and that she would not allow political maneuvering by students or their families to force out an employee who had consistently demonstrated competence and professionalism. Meanwhile, Chad's campaign to challenge Maria's position was expanding beyond administrative channels into the realm of social pressure and community opinion. He had begun sharing carefully edited versions of their cafeteria confrontation with parents and community leaders, emphasizing Maria's knowledge of private family information while minimizing the behavior that had prompted her revelations. The strategy was designed to raise concerns about privacy and appropriate boundaries between school staff and student families, without directly acknowledging the harassment and disrespect that had motivated Maria's response. Chad was portraying himself as the victim of an adult who had overreacted to normal teenage behavior, using her own competence and knowledge as evidence that she represented some kind of threat to student welfare. The effectiveness of this approach became apparent when Maria began receiving subtle indications that some community members were questioning her role at the school. Parents who had previously been friendly during school events became more distant, and she noticed increased scrutiny during her daily activities in town. The change was not dramatic enough to constitute harassment, but it suggested that Chad's efforts to reshape the narrative were having some success. Maria recognized the pattern from her military experience with information warfare and community relations in contested environments. Chad was using the community's natural protective instincts regarding their children to create suspicion about her motives and appropriateness, regardless of the actual facts surrounding their confrontation. The strategy was particularly effective because it relied on people's emotions and preconceptions, rather than requiring them to evaluate evidence or consider complex circumstances. Her response was informed by lessons learned during military operations where winning hearts and minds was as important as achieving tactical objectives. Rather than attempting to defend herself through direct confrontation or detailed explanations, she focused on demonstrating her value to the community through consistent positive actions and relationships. Maria began volunteering for additional school activities that would increase her visibility and allow more people to observe her interactions with students and staff. She offered to help with food service for evening events like parent conferences and athletic competitions, providing opportunities for parents and community members to see her professionalism and dedication firsthand. She also started a small program to provide basic nutrition education to students who were interested in learning about healthy eating and food preparation. The sessions were informal and voluntary, held during lunch periods for students who wanted to understand more about the food they were eating and how it was prepared. The program attracted students from various social groups and provided positive interactions that demonstrated her commitment to student welfare. The nutrition education sessions proved particularly effective at countering Chad's narrative because they showed Maria using her knowledge and experience to benefit students rather than to threaten or control them. Parents who heard about the program from their children began to see her as a positive influence who was contributing to their education rather than someone who posed risks to their privacy or safety. Tommy Chen became one of the most enthusiastic participants in the nutrition program, and his positive reports to his parents helped spread word about Maria's genuine interest in student welfare. His transformation from a frequently bullied freshman to a more confident young person who stood up for others provided concrete evidence of Maria's positive impact on the school environment. As November progressed, the administrative investigation that Chad had hoped would remove Maria from her position began to produce results that were quite different from what he had intended. The district's review of hiring procedures and background verification had indeed raised questions about the completeness of Maria's file. But the gaps were quickly filled through contact with military personnel officers and former supervisors, who provided glowing recommendations. The investigation also revealed that Maria's qualifications were actually superior to the minimum requirements for her position, and that her performance evaluations were consistently excellent. More importantly, the inquiry had prompted several parents and community members to share positive feedback about their interactions with her, creating a record of community support that contradicted the concerns that Chad had attempted to raise. Principal Hayes had been monitoring the situation closely, and his assessment was that the investigation had actually strengthened Maria's position rather than weakening it. The documentation now available in her personnel file provided clear evidence of her qualifications and character, while the community feedback demonstrated that concerns about her appropriateness were not widely shared. The principal's evaluation of Chad's role in initiating the investigation was less favorable. While he understood the family's stress and the teenager's desire to restore his social position, he was concerned about the pattern of behavior that had led to the confrontation and the attempt to use administrative procedures to avoid accountability for inappropriate actions. Hayes scheduled a meeting with Chad and his parents to discuss the situation and establish clear expectations for future behavior. The conversation was challenging for all participants, as it required acknowledging both the family's legal troubles and Chad's need to take responsibility for his actions rather than seeking to blame others for consequences that resulted from his own choices. The meeting concluded with agreements about Chad's conduct and his relationship with school staff, including specific expectations about respectful behavior and appropriate boundaries in all interactions. The principal made it clear that future attempts to use administrative procedures to target staff members would be viewed as harassment and would result in serious disciplinary consequences. By the end of November, the dynamics at Riverside High had shifted in ways that reflected the Complex lessons learned from the extended confrontation between Maria and Chad's group. The incident had evolved from a simple case of teenage disrespect into a broader examination of power, accountability, and community values that had touched multiple families and institutions. Chad's strategy of escalation had ultimately backfired, strengthening Maria's position while exposing his own inability to accept responsibility for his behavior. The administrative investigation he had hoped would remove her had instead documented her qualifications and community support, while his own actions had attracted unfavorable attention from school administrators and raised questions about his judgment and character. Maria had emerged from the extended challenge with her position secure and her reputation enhanced, but she understood that the experience had changed her role within the school community. She was no longer invisible or underestimated, which brought both opportunities and responsibilities that she would need to navigate carefully in the months ahead. The transformation of Riverside High's social ecosystem became fully apparent in December, as the school community settled into patterns of interaction that reflected the lessons learned from the extended confrontation between Maria Santos and the students who had initially underestimated her. The changes were subtle but significant, marking a shift in how power was understood and exercised within the institution's complex social hierarchy. Chad Morrison's position within the student body had been fundamentally altered by his failed attempt to challenge Maria through administrative channels. The investigation he had hoped would remove her from her position had instead highlighted his own pattern of inappropriate behavior while documenting her qualifications and community support. More importantly, his inability to accept responsibility for his actions had become apparent to classmates who had previously viewed him as a natural leader. The senior class presidency that had once seemed like a stepping stone to greater achievements now felt more like a burden as Chad struggled to maintain influence among peers who had witnessed his public humiliation and subsequent failure to address it effectively. His college prospects remained uncertain due to his family's financial troubles, and the social capital he had accumulated over years of athletic and academic success was rapidly diminishing. Chad's relationship with his former inner circle had also evolved in ways that reflected each member's individual response to the challenges they had faced. The unity that had once characterized their group had been replaced by a more cautious dynamic, as each person focused on managing their own family crises rather than supporting collective social dominance. Mason Torres had perhaps shown the most genuine growth among the group, though his progress remained uneven and incomplete. His initial curiosity about Maria's background had evolved into something approaching respect for her capabilities and insights, and he had begun to question his own assumptions about appropriate behavior and the use of humor as a weapon against those perceived as inferior. The viral videos and social media pranks that had once been Mason's primary creative outlet had been replaced by more constructive projects that focused on highlighting positive aspects of school life rather than targeting vulnerable individuals for entertainment. His follower count had actually increased as he shifted toward content that celebrated achievement and community rather than mocking weakness and difference. Mason's relationship with his family had also improved as a result of the honest conversations, prompted by Maria's revelations about their financial situation. His father's job at the automotive plant was indeed precarious, but the family's willingness to discuss their challenges openly had led to better planning and preparation for potential difficulties. Mason had even begun working part-time to help with family expenses, an experience that had given him new perspective on the value of service work and the dignity of all forms of honest employment. Jake Russell had used the crisis surrounding his family's auto repair business as an opportunity to develop new skills and explore different approaches to his future. His conversations with his parents about their financial struggles had been painful but productive, leading to innovative strategies for adapting their business model to changing market conditions. Jake's athletic abilities had attracted attention from several colleges that could offer academic scholarships to supplement his sports participation, creating opportunities that didn't depend entirely on his family's financial resources. More importantly, his experience of economic uncertainty had given him empathy for classmates who faced similar challenges, transforming him from someone who dismissed others' struggles into an advocate for students who needed support. The Russell family's auto repair business had actually benefited from the increased community awareness of their situation, as neighbors and customers made deliberate efforts to support local businesses during challenging times. Jake's willingness to work alongside his father after school and during weekends had also strengthened their relationship while giving him practical skills that would serve him well regardless of his college and career choices. Brittany Walsh had faced the most significant challenges in adapting to her family's changed circumstances, as the federal investigation into her grandfather's banking practices had attracted widespread media attention that made privacy impossible. The Walsh family's social position in Oakville had been built on generations of financial success and community leadership, and the suggestion that their current situation might be compromised by regulatory violations had shaken their sense of identity and purpose. Brittany's social media presence had been dramatically scaled back as she grappled with the reality that her family's influence was more precarious than she had understood. The followers who had once been eager to engage with her content about exclusive events and insider access had begun to lose interest, as her posts became more guarded and less revealing about her privileged lifestyle. However, the crisis had also provided opportunities for Brittany to develop more authentic relationships with classmates who appreciated her vulnerability and honesty about facing difficulties. Her willingness to acknowledge her family's problems and ask for support had surprised many students who had previously viewed her as untouchable and self-sufficient. The banking investigation had ultimately resulted in regulatory penalties rather than criminal charges, but the Walsh family's reputation in the community had been permanently altered. Brittany's grandfather had chosen to retire early and sell his interests in the bank, providing resources to address the regulatory concerns while removing the family from direct involvement in the institution that had been central to their identity for decades. Destiny Kim's situation had proven to be the most complex and potentially dangerous, as the embezzlement cover-up at the automotive parts factory had continued to create risks for her father's position and the family's stability. The ethical implications of her father's cooperation in concealing criminal activity had created ongoing tensions within the family as they struggled to balance practical concerns with moral principles. Destiny's relationship with Chad had ended during the autumn crisis, partly due to the stress both families were experiencing, but also because of her growing awareness that their social position had been built on foundations that were more fragile than either had realized. The breakup had been amicable but decisive, reflecting their mutual recognition that their future paths were likely to diverge significantly. The Kim family had ultimately decided to address the embezzlement situation through proper channels, with Destiny's father providing information to corporate investigators in exchange for whistleblower protections that would safeguard his position. While ensuring that the original theft was properly addressed, the decision had been difficult and risky, but it had resolved the ethical concerns that had been troubling the family while establishing a foundation for honest rebuilding of their reputation. Destiny's social position at school had been affected by these changes, but she had discovered that her intelligence and work ethic were valued by classmates and teachers regardless of her family's social status. Her academic performance had actually improved as she focused on achievements that were entirely her own, rather than derived from external circumstances beyond her control. Throughout these individual transformations, Maria had continued her daily work in the cafeteria while observing the evolving dynamics with the analytical perspective that had served her throughout her military career. The changes she witnessed were neither dramatic nor revolutionary, but they represented meaningful shifts in how students related to each other and to the adults who worked in their school environment. The nutrition education program that Maria had started during the November crisis had grown into a popular activity that attracted students from various social groups and academic levels. The sessions provided opportunities for positive interactions that demonstrated her genuine interest in student welfare while teaching practical skills that participants could use throughout their lives. Tommy Chen had become one of the program's most enthusiastic advocates, and his transformation from a frequently bullied freshman to a confident young person who stood up for others had inspired similar changes in other students who had previously felt powerless in the face of social pressure. The ripple effects of his increased confidence had contributed to a broader cultural shift that made bullying less acceptable and support for vulnerable students more common. Angela Rodriguez had also been affected by the events of the autumn, though her changes were more subtle and personal than those experienced by the students involved in the original confrontation. Her friendship with Maria had deepened as she learned more about her colleagues' background and capabilities, and she had begun to view her own work in the cafeteria as more significant and meaningful than she had previously realized. The collaboration between Maria and Angela had improved the efficiency and quality of the cafeteria operation in ways that benefited the entire school community. Their combined experience and complementary skills had created innovations in food service that other schools in the district had begun to study and adopt. Mrs. Fleming had also grown professionally through her experience managing the crisis. Surrounding Maria's background investigation, her handling of the administrative challenges and community pressures had demonstrated leadership capabilities that had been recognized by district administrators, leading to opportunities for advancement and increased responsibilities. The cafeteria staff as a whole had developed a stronger sense of unity and purpose through their shared experience of supporting Maria during the investigation and community scrutiny. They had come to understand that their work was valued and important, not just for providing nutrition, but for creating a positive environment that contributed to student learning and social development. Principal Hayes had used the lessons learned from the Maria Santos situation to develop new policies and procedures for addressing student behavior issues and supporting staff members who face challenges from students or community members. His leadership during the crisis had been noticed by district administrators and had enhanced his reputation as an effective educational leader. The broader student body had also been affected by the events, though many had experienced the changes indirectly through shifts in social dynamics and cultural expectations, rather than through direct involvement in the confrontations. The demonstration that seemingly powerless adults might possess hidden capabilities and knowledge had created a more respectful atmosphere in interactions between students and staff throughout the school. Teachers and other support staff had reported improvements in student behavior and engagement that they attributed partly to the increased awareness that adults in the school environment might have more complex backgrounds and capabilities than students initially realized. The changes were not universal or dramatic, but they represented meaningful progress toward creating a more respectful and supportive educational environment. As December progressed toward the winter break, Maria reflected on the unexpected ways that her military background had been revealed and utilized in her civilian role. The confrontation with Chad's group had forced her to acknowledge capabilities she had hoped to keep private, but the experience had also demonstrated that her skills could be used constructively to benefit the school community rather than simply for personal protection or career advancement. The nutrition education program, her collaboration with school administrators on safety and security issues, and her mentorship of students like Tommy Chen had all emerged from the crisis as positive applications of her military training and experience. Rather than being a liability that complicated her civilian life, her background had become a resource that enhanced her contributions to the community. Maria understood that her role at Riverside High had been permanently changed by the events of the autumn, but she was satisfied that the changes had been largely positive for both herself and the school community. She was no longer invisible or underestimated, which brought both opportunities and responsibilities that she was prepared to embrace as she continued her service in this different but equally important mission of feeding and supporting young people during their educational journey. The lessons learned by all participants in the extended confrontation had created a foundation for continued growth and improvement in the months and years ahead. The experience had demonstrated that respect, accountability, and understanding were essential elements of any healthy community, and that individuals from all backgrounds had valuable contributions to make when they were treated with dignity and given opportunities to share their knowledge and capabilities. Spring arrived at Riverside High with an energy that seemed to mirror the profound changes that had taken place throughout the school year. Maria Santos stood in the cafeteria kitchen at dawn, preparing for what would be her final week at the EE, institution that had become an unexpected battlefield for lessons about respect, dignity, and the hidden depths that people carry within themselves. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated equipment that had become as familiar as the weapons and tools she had once mastered in military service, yet served an entirely different purpose in nurturing rather than destroying. The transformation that had begun with a simple confrontation over a hairnet had rippled through every corner of the school community, creating changes that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in that October afternoon encounter. Maria had observed these developments with the same analytical precision she had once applied to military operations, but with a growing sense of satisfaction that came from witnessing positive human growth rather than tactical victories. Tommy Chen had evolved from the frightened freshman who once cowered in hallways to a confident young leader who organized study groups for struggling students and served as a bridge between different social groups that had previously existed. In isolation, his transformation had been perhaps the most visible symbol of the cultural shift that had occurred throughout Riverside High, demonstrating that courage and leadership could emerge from the most unexpected sources when given proper guidance and support. The nutrition education program that Maria had initiated during the crisis had grown into a comprehensive life skills curriculum that attracted students from every grade level and social background. What had begun as informal conversations about healthy eating had expanded to include lessons about budgeting, meal planning, basic cooking techniques, and understanding food systems. The program had become so popular that other schools in the district were requesting information about implementing similar initiatives. More importantly, the program had created a space where traditional social hierarchies dissolved in favor of collaborative learning and mutual support. Students who had never spoken to each other in hallways found themselves working together on projects that required combining different perspectives and skills. The artificial barriers that had once seemed insurmountable were gradually eroding, as young people discovered common interests and shared challenges that transcended their superficial differences. Angela Rodriguez had been promoted to Assistant Supervisor of Food Services for the entire district, a position that recognized her growing expertise in nutrition education and community outreach. Her collaboration with Maria had demonstrated capabilities that had previously been overlooked by administrators who viewed cafeteria work as simple manual labor, rather than a profession requiring intelligence, creativity, and interpersonal skills. The partnership between Maria and Angela had revolutionized food service operations throughout the district, implementing efficiency improvements and quality enhancements that had attracted attention from state education officials. Their innovations in reducing waste, improving nutritional content, and creating positive dining experiences had become models for other school systems facing similar challenges with limited resources and diverse student populations. Mrs. Fleming had accepted an offer to serve as Director of Nutrition Services for a regional consortium of school districts, a position that would allow her to share the lessons learned at Riverside High with a much broader community. Her leadership during the challenges of the previous year had demonstrated administrative capabilities that extended far beyond traditional food service management, encompassing crisis communication, community relations, and educational programming. Chad Morrison had graduated in May with grades that were respectable but unremarkable, his college plans modified to reflect his family's changed financial circumstances. The scholarship to Ohio State had indeed been lost when the family's economic situation became public knowledge, but Chad had found opportunities at a smaller state university that offered both affordability and academic programs suited to his interests and abilities. The humbling experiences of his senior year had taught Chad valuable lessons about privilege, responsibility, and the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. His farewell speech at graduation had included a public apology to Maria and acknowledgement of the ways his behavior had needed to change, demonstrating a level of maturity and self-awareness that had been absent during his earlier years at Riverside. Chad's family had weathered the state investigation into their construction practices through cooperation with authorities and implementation of improved safety and compliance procedures. Morrison Construction had paid significant fines and faced restrictions on certain types of projects, but the business had survived and gradually begun to rebuild its reputation through transparent operations and community service initiatives. The experience had strengthened the Morrison family's relationships with each other as they learned to face challenges together rather than maintaining facades of success that concealed serious problems. Chad's younger siblings had benefited from the increased honesty and communication within the family, developing resilience and character that would serve them well in their own future challenges. Mason Torres had channeled his creativity and social media skills into a successful online platform that highlighted positive stories about young people in small-town communities across Ohio. His content had evolved from superficial pranks and mockery to meaningful journalism that celebrated achievement, overcame obstacles, and contributed to their communities in significant ways. The platform had attracted sponsorships from organizations interested in supporting youth development and rural education, providing Mason with income that helped his family navigate their ongoing financial challenges while building professional experience that would benefit his college and career plans. His work had been recognized by several journalism organizations and had opened doors to internship opportunities at major media companies. Mason's transformation from class clown to serious journalist had surprised many of his former classmates, but those who had observed his intelligence and creativity had always suspected that he possessed capabilities beyond entertainment and social manipulation. His success had demonstrated that negative behaviors often mask positive potential, that can be redirected toward constructive purposes when appropriate guidance and opportunities are provided. Jake Russell had accepted a full academic scholarship to study mechanical engineering at a technical university known for its programs in automotive and manufacturing systems. His experience working in his family's auto repair business had sparked genuine interest in understanding how mechanical systems functioned and could be improved through engineering design and innovation. The Russell family business had indeed struggled with competition from chain stores and online retailers, but Jake's technical education and modern business training had helped them develop new strategies for serving customers who needed specialized services that larger companies could not provide efficiently. The business had shifted focus toward custom modifications, restoration projects, and technical consulting that utilized their decades of experience and local community connections. Jake's athletic achievements had continued through his senior year, but his perspective on sports had matured as he came to understand that physical capabilities were tools for building character and relationships rather than weapons for establishing dominance over others. His leadership on the football team had emphasized teamwork, mutual support, and respect for opponents, rather than the aggressive intimidation tactics that had characterized his earlier approach to competition. Brittany Walsh had discovered talents in financial analysis and business management that had been overshadowed by her focus on social media influence and popular culture. The crisis surrounding her grandfather's banking practices had prompted her to learn more about financial systems and regulatory compliance, knowledge that had proven both personally valuable and academically interesting. Brittany's college plans had been modified to include studies in business administration and financial planning, career paths that would allow her to help individuals and small businesses navigate complex economic challenges. Her experience with her family's difficulties had given her empathy for others facing financial stress and uncertainty, motivating her to use her intelligence and communication skills to provide practical assistance rather than mere entertainment. The Walsh family had recovered more successfully than initially expected from the banking investigation, partly due to their willingness to cooperate fully with regulators and implement comprehensive reforms that exceeded minimum compliance requirements. Brittany's grandfather had used his retirement as an opportunity to establish a financial literacy foundation that provided education and resources to help community members make informed decisions about money management and investment. Destiny Kim had emerged from her family's crisis with a clearer understanding of her own values and priorities, leading to academic and personal choices that reflected genuine interests rather than external expectations or social pressures. Her decision to end her relationship with Chad had been part of a broader process of examining which aspects of her life were authentic expressions of her personality and which were performances designed to maintain social status. Destiny's academic performance had improved significantly as she focused on subjects that genuinely interested her, rather than courses chosen primarily for their impact on her grade point average and college applications. Her particular strength in mathematics and science had led to opportunities in engineering and technology fields that offered both intellectual challenges and practical applications for solving real-world problems. The Kim family had successfully navigated the workplace ethics investigation through Destiny's father's decision to provide complete information to corporate investigators, rather than continuing to conceal the embezzlement that had complicated his advancement. The resolution had resulted in prosecution of the original theft and implementation of improved financial controls, while protecting whistleblowers who had helped expose the problems. Destiny's father had been promoted to a regional management position that recognized both his technical expertise and his demonstrated commitment to ethical business practices. The family's social position in Oakville had been restored through their willingness to prioritize integrity over convenience, earning respect from community members who valued honesty and accountability over wealth and influence. Principal Hayes had been selected for a superintendent position in a larger district, recognition of his leadership during the various challenges that had tested Riverside High throughout the school year. His handling of the conflicts between students and staff had demonstrated administrative skills that balanced support for all community members with firm enforcement of behavioral expectations and ethical standards. The policies and procedures that Hayes had developed for addressing student misconduct and supporting staff members had been adopted by other schools throughout the region, creating systematic approaches to preventing and resolving conflicts before they escalated into serious problems. His emphasis on restorative justice rather than purely punitive discipline had produced measurable improvements in school climate and student behavior. Hayes's replacement as principal was a former military officer who had transitioned to education. After retiring from active duty, someone who understood both the challenges of leadership in complex environments and the importance of creating inclusive communities where all members felt valued and respected. The selection was viewed by many as validation of the lessons learned from Maria's experience and influence at the school. As Maria prepared for her final week at Riverside High, she reflected on the unexpected ways that her military background had been revealed and utilized in her civilian role. The confrontation with Chad's group had forced her to acknowledge capabilities she had hoped to keep private, but the experience had also demonstrated that her skills could be used constructively to benefit the school community rather than simply for personal protection or advancement. The nutrition education program, her collaboration with school administrators on safety and security issues, and her mentorship of students like Tommy Chen had all emerged from the crisis as positive applications of her military training and experience. Rather than being a liability that complicated her civilian life, her background had become a resource that enhanced her contributions to the community. Maria's decision to leave Riverside High was motivated by an opportunity that had emerged from the recognition her work had received throughout the school district and beyond. The state education department had offered her a position developing nutrition and life skills curricula for schools throughout Ohio, work that would allow her to share the innovations she had pioneered at Riverside High with thousands of students across the state. The new position would also provide opportunities to train other school nutrition professionals in techniques for creating positive dining experiences that supported both physical health and social development. Maria's unique combination of military leadership experience and educational innovation had created expertise that was desperately needed in school systems struggling to serve diverse student populations with limited resources. The offer had come through contacts developed during the federal investigation into her background, when military personnel offices had been contacted to verify her qualifications and service record. Officials who reviewed her file had been impressed by both her military achievements and her successful transition to civilian education work, leading to recommendations that had ultimately resulted in the state position offer. Maria's final day at Riverside High was marked by celebrations and acknowledgements that reflected the profound impact she had made on the school community during her 4 years of service. Students from every grade level and social background participated in events that honored her contributions while demonstrating the lessons they had learned about respect, dignity, and the hidden potential that exists within every individual. Tommy Chen had organized a presentation that featured testimonials from students who had been affected by Maria's mentorship and guidance, stories that illustrated the ripple effects of her influence throughout the school community. The presentations were emotional and powerful, demonstrating how a single adult's commitment to treating young people with respect and high expectations could transform lives in ways that extended far beyond classroom instruction. The nutrition education program participants had prepared a comprehensive cookbook that compiled recipes, nutritional information, and life skills lessons from their work with Maria throughout the year. The cookbook was designed to be shared with other schools implementing similar programs, ensuring that the knowledge and techniques developed at Riverside High would continue to benefit students in other communities. Faculty and staff members had contributed to a professional development guide that documented Maria's approaches to conflict resolution, community building, and educational programming. The guide was intended for use by school administrators and nutrition professionals who wanted to create similar positive changes in their own institutions, spreading the influence of her work beyond the immediate Riverside High community. Angela Rodriguez had been selected to continue managing the nutrition education program at Riverside High, while also serving as a liaison with other schools interested in implementing similar initiatives. Her promotion and expanded responsibilities were recognition of the leadership capabilities she had developed through her collaboration with Maria and her own commitment to student welfare and educational excellence. Mrs. Fleming's farewell remarks at the celebration emphasized the ways that Maria's example had elevated the entire cafeteria operation and changed perceptions about the importance of nutrition services in educational settings. She credited Maria with transforming food service from a necessary support function into an integral component of student learning and development. The most powerful moment of the celebration came when Chad Morrison, who had returned to Riverside High specifically for the event, delivered a speech acknowledging the lessons he had learned from his confrontations with Maria and expressing gratitude for her patience in helping him understand the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. Chad's words were particularly meaningful because they demonstrated genuine understanding of the ways his behavior had needed to change, rather than superficial apologies designed to restore his social position. His acknowledgement of Maria's positive influence on his character development was witnessed by the entire school community, providing a powerful example of accountability and personal growth. As Maria drove away from Riverside High for the final time, she carried with her the satisfaction that came from knowing she had used her unique background and capabilities to make a positive difference in the lives of young people who represented the future of their community and nation. The military skills that had once been applied to training warriors were now being used to develop citizens who understood the importance of respect, integrity, and service to others. The experience at Riverside High had taught Maria that the transition from military to civilian life could be more than simply finding new ways to apply old skills. It could be an opportunity to discover entirely new purposes and meanings for the capabilities developed through years of dedicated service. Her work with students and families had been as challenging and rewarding as any mission she had undertaken during her military career, requiring the same levels of strategic thinking, interpersonal skills, and commitment to excellence. The state education position would provide new opportunities to serve communities throughout Ohio, helping school systems create environments where all students could thrive, regardless of their social background or economic circumstances. The lessons learned at Riverside High about respect, dignity, and the hidden potential within every individual would guide her work in training nutrition professionals and developing educational programs that supported both physical health and character development. Maria's story had become part of the culture and traditions of Riverside High, a reminder to future students and staff members that every person deserves respect and has valuable contributions to make when given appropriate opportunities and support. The changes she had helped create would continue to influence the school community long after her departure, ensuring that her legacy would be measured not in individual achievements, but in the positive impact on countless lives over many years. The confrontation that had begun with teenage mockery and a grabbed hairnet had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of school culture that demonstrated the power of individual courage, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to treating all people with dignity. Maria Santos had proven that true strength came not from dominating others, but from lifting them up, and that the most profound victories were achieved not through force, but through patient persistence in doing what was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.